Good afternoon. Welcome to today's session, which is a discussion on other disputes in the context of an enfranchisement claim. So looking at the course aims slide today, this is what we're going to be covering in the next hour. So we're going to start by going through some basics, and then I'm going to give you 3 examples of other litigation that can arise in the context of an enfranchisement claim. And then we're going to finish off today by looking at some ways to mitigate that risk. So looking at the next slide, this sets out the scope of what we're really talking about today. So we are talking about leasehold flats, and that incorporates both collective enfranchisement, right of first refusal, mixed-use premises. We're also talking about lease extensions, whether that's a formal transaction or an informal transaction. What we are not looking at today is leasehold houses, complex estates, and common hold. Now, in terms of the relevant legislation, the next slide sets out what the primary pieces of legislation are that we'll be looking at today. So the 1993 Act, we're all very familiar with, deals with collective enfranchisement claims and lease extensions for flats. The 1987 Act deals with the right of first refusal. In terms of where the dispute legislation sits, there are multiple different pieces of legislation that cover disputes. In fact, there's approximately 20 pieces of legislation. These 3 on this slide are where the crux of the disputes that commonly arise in the context of enfranchisement arise. And that includes, for example, the 2002 Act, which also deals with right to manage and common hold, but has a section towards the back end of it that deals with other dispute areas that are pertinent. We've also got the 1985 Act. Sections 18 to 30 deal with landlord and tenant service charge disputes, and that's something we're going to cover later on in today's session. And then you have the Law of Property Act 1925, which is where the forfeiture legislation sits. So before we move on to looking at some examples of common disputes, what we're going to have a very quick look at on the next slide is the procedure overview. And very broadly, there are 4 stages to a standard traditional enfranchisement claim. Now, what you see on this slide deals with lease extensions and collective claims. Right of first refusal has a slightly different procedure, but some of the concepts are quite similar. So the first tranche of tasks that the leaseholder's lawyer will need to start with is to check qualifying criteria, because of course not everybody qualifies for a collective claim or a lease extension claim. You'll also, as part of that, want to be checking whether or not there are any exceptions. So for example, if you have a leaseholder who wishes to undertake a lease extension in a shared ownership property and they have not yet fully staircased, they don't qualify, they're not qualifying tenants for the purposes of the 1993 Act, and therefore they can't do a lease extension. Exceptions also include landlords who cannot be enfranchised against. As part of that, you're also going to be wanting to consider ancillary issues. And this is relatively new in the last sort of 18 to 24 months because of all of the reforms that are ongoing. Now, the ancillary issues consider things like satellite litigation, which is the topic of today's session. Once you've carried out all of your checks, you then move on to the notice serving stage, the tenant going first in most cases, except for right of first refusal, where the landlord, of course, serves their Section 5 notice in the first instance. So before doing that, the tenant will need to obtain a valuation from a qualified valuer to ascertain the starting premium in the case of a lease extension and price in the case of a collective claim, and then go on to serving a claim or an initial notice. Once that has been done, the landlord will then carry out their own checks, make sure that the tenant or the leaseholders collectively satisfy the qualifying criteria. Coming back to my shared ownership example, also checking that the leaseholder has 100% staircase in order to check that they qualify. And then they will eventually serve their counter notice. Once you've done that, you then move on to the negotiation stage, which considers the premium or the price, the terms of either the lease or the transfer, and then finally having a discussion about the landlord's costs, that being Section 33 under the 93 Act and Section 60 for lease extension claims. Once the terms have been agreed, you then move on to the last stage, which is conveyancing stage, which is where you undertake any final checks, transfer the funds, complete, and then apply to the land registry. So on the next slide, we are looking here at specific disputes that can arise in the context of enfranchisement. And this is very, very common in an enfranchisement claim. It's supposed to be uncontentious on the whole, but unfortunately, it is very, very common for enfranchisement-specific disputes to arise during the course of a transaction. Most of the disputes will revolve around the premium or price payable. So that is valuation dispute, so looking at things like deferment rates, capitalization rates, the level of marriage value payable, and more recently, the real open market value of the premises on the freehold vacant possession on the open market. Now, today's session, we are not going into the enfranchisement specific disputes. That is covered in a separate session, which you are very welcome to join us for. We go into the valuation element as well as the legal disputes, as well as some of the newer disputes that have started to pop up around us. So in terms of what we're looking at today, the next slide sets out a table of all the other different disputes that can arise in the context of an enfranchisement dispute, and which are perhaps a little less obvious. So as an enfranchisement lawyer, we are all very, very familiar with dealing with disputes over, does the notice qualify? Has it been served properly? Has a leaseholder perhaps missed a statutory deadline before issuing either the tribunal or the court proceedings? There's all sorts of disputes and litigation in the enfranchisement space. What we're talking about today is other things that can arise during an enfranchisement dispute, which enfranchisement lawyers need to be aware of, mainly in the context of understanding how it impacts the enfranchisement claim. And on the left-hand side of the slide, you will see that these are very specific landlord and tenant disputes. So very common to get arrears issues, especially in a collective claim. Quite often the driver behind leaseholders wanting to collectively enfranchise, or indeed do a right to manage claim, is because they are unhappy with the level of service charges that the landlord has raised, usually in the context of major works. Sometimes you can also get issues arise in relation to unauthorised alterations. There might be a live appointment of manager application under the 1987 Act Part 4, where the leaseholders are seeking to have the manager or landlord replaced with their own manager, well, the court-appointed manager, to take over the management of the building. And that, of course, can have a big impact on enfranchisement. There might also be separately a right to manage claim, or something we are going to delve into details today, building and fire safety. On the other side of the slide, you will see all the other types of disputes that can also arise and directly impact an enfranchisement claim. So you'll see here, I've listed things like planning, party wall claims, neighbour disputes and nuisance. Now, rooftop developments is a fairly new issue that is arising far more frequently than it ever did. Now, rooftop developments has always been an option for landlords in terms of how to realise their assets. So this deals with the concept of building more flats on top of the existing